And, I can see why people would ask that. They think, oh, you must have had a bitterness. There must have been some problem. There must have been some secret sin in your life, like something that you just didn't want, being moral restraints. You really just didn't, you wanted to do something morally wrong, and you just couldn't have, you get all these people trying to psychoanalyze why you would leave the faith that they still have, right? Not because I discovered that it was untrue, or that their views are wrong. They are always trying to tinker with some psychological thing. What was wrong? What was the one thing? But it was a gradual thing, and I'm making a long story very short, but over those 4 or 5 years, I've moved over here to more of a moderate, even to more of a liberal, and as I started reading even some liberal Christian scholars and theologians, I often disagreed with them, but I thought, they're not bad guys. Tillich wasn't a really bad guy, he wasn't, I think he's wrong about this, but, he started defining God not in personal terms, but phrases he would use were like, God is the ground of all being. In fact, that's the exact phrase that this Lutheran minister used yesterday. I was at the World Religions Conference in Waterloo, Canada, and there were 8 world religions. Well, there were 7 world religions and me, the atheist. And they invited an atheist to the table there. And the Lutheran minister, they asked him to define God, and he used that phrase, well, God is the ground of all being. I thought, where have I heard that before? What does that mean, actually, the ground of all being? Why not just call the ground of all being the ground of all being? Why call it God? But anyway, that's how liberals talk. And I started reading liberals, how they would be wishy-washy. In fact, they were lukewarm. Like Jesus said, you should be hot or cold, you should be lukewarm. And I eventually, in my own mind, became one of those hated liberals in my own brain. Even though outwardly I was still preaching the same kind of sermons, I was still out doing the stuff that worked because I was good at it, and I was still singing the same song that had those fundamentalist things. In my own brain, I was having this transformation that was starting to get pretty horrible because I realized, wait a minute, intellectually, things aren't adding up. Socially and emotionally and traditionally, things were just fine, And my mom and dad were so glad their ordained Christian son was out preaching the gospel. They were so happy about that. And my little brother Daryl, both of my brothers were believers. And but in my own mind, I was going through this process, and I was hardly even telling myself. And eventually, I was swung clear across the spectrum, and hardly anyone knew outwardly what was going on, but just in my own thoughts, I got to this point where I realized, well, if the prodigal son is just a parable, and there's nothing wrong with that, and if Adam and Eve are a metaphor, a positive myth, well, then maybe God himself is just one huge figure of speech. Maybe that's all it is. Maybe the whole thing is just one of these metaphorical, fable, myth things that we use to try to give meaning to our life. And it was for a long time that I didn't realize that I had lost my faith. I still thought I had my faith, but I realized that if I'm defining things like that, then what is it? And I was desperately reading science. And I remember an article that Ben Bova wrote in Omni magazine, back when that magazine was running. He wrote an article about creationism. It's called Creationists Equal Time. In fact, a couple months ago, we got to interview Ben Bova on our national radio show, and it was really fun to tell him. Often you don't get to tell an author how much their work impacted you, but I got to tell him that way back in the 80s, that one article you wrote really had an impact, where he said, creationists talk about wanting equal time, right? We want equal time for the controversy. But how many of them would welcome a chapter about evolution between Genesis and Exodus? How many of them will invite an evolutionist into their pulpit? Right? Do they really want equal time, or are they just using the equal time argument? And regardless of the merits of that article, it kind of took the lens that I was looking at the whole world, and the lens kind of went like this. And I started looking at myself like, oh, so that's how others see me. Oh, so that's how I thought I had it all figured out. I was so sure of the gospel, of the absolute truth and all of that. And some of this reading was like taking that lens. It was out there saying, the Mormons are wrong, the Muslims are wrong, the Hindus are wrong, and that same lens came up to myself. But what was really weird was just like two parts of the brain were going at once. This one part of the brain was sort of analytical, rational, skeptical, cautious, waiting, agnostic. whatever. And the other part of the brain was still talking with God. And that was strange. I remember driving the freeways home from some recording studio or from some preaching thing, wrestling and thinking and talking, and I would say, "Dear Jesus, please help me through this and give strength in my faith," and I would feel like I was getting an answer. But another part of my brain was going, "That's really weird. Dan's talking with God. Isn't that interesting? How can he be talking with God? Why does he think he's doing?" Like a split brain hand, you know. And if you think there's insanity there, well, there you go. That kind of thing had to happen. That kind of objectivity and distance had to happen. John Loftus wrote a book about, he was a former preacher as well, and he also lost his faith for intellectual reason. And he developed this, it's not new, but he formulated this new argument called the outsider test. If your faith and your beliefs are really valid, then subject them to the outsider test, as if you were looking at it from the outside. And I guess that's what's happening with me. And there's a little voice in the back of my brain that's saying, come on, you know something's wrong here. Something's wrong, right? That's what you would tell a Muslim in Baghdad, right? Something's wrong with their thinking. That's what you would tell them. You would hope they would have the courage to raise up out of that culture and think for themselves, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you applaud that? If a Muslim came up and said, I'm rejecting all that of course I would have said for Christianity, but for whatever the reason, you would applaud that independence of spirit and mind, to get outside of yourself and think for yourself, and to even brave the social disapproval that might come from that. And his little voice kept getting louder. Something's wrong. And eventually I realized, you know what? I don't have any reason to believe. The way I phrase it is that I dumped out all the bath water, and I realized there's no baby there. You know, all of this stuff that like when C.S. Lewis talked about mere Christianity, he thought mere Christianity, you could strip off all the non-essential, but there'd be this basic Christianity at the core. And that's what I was looking for. But you kept peeling the onion back. Okay, where's the middle? Where's the pretty soon it's gone, right? And so I got to this point where I realized, you know what, there really is no evidence for God. All those miracles that I thought I saw, I didn't realize that most of those people went home and got even sicker or died. You know, although for a while they said they were healed. I never really saw what amounted to an organic healing. We saw some crutches thrown away, but I never saw any glass eyeballs or prosthetic devices thrown away. Have you ever thought about that? Why can God heal certain things, but others he can't? It's like there's a limit. The things he can't heal are the verifiable things, I guess. And then I realized Jesus is probably not going to come again. And even in the New Testament, Jesus told his own disciples, there'll be some of you standing here who won't taste death until you see the Son of God coming in. I'm forgetting the words now, but coming in his glory. And I realized there's no evidence for God. There's no good argument for God. All these arguments like first cause and moral and ontological, and they on the surface they sound kind of persuasive if you're inside the religion. Even Bertrand Russell admitted that as a young man he was briefly convinced of the existence of God by the ontological argument. If you don't know what that is, don't bother. But although Swinburne spent his whole life, Swinburne and I debated in Dublin a few years ago. But the next morning, Bertrand Russell woke up and he said, silly me. All the ontological arguments are just bad grammar, basically. And he was embarrassed that he was momentarily tricked by the ontological argument. And there's these tricks in the mind that we think will really make sense, right? And I thought they made sense. There's no evidence for God. There's no argument for a God. There's no coherent definition of a God. In fact, many of the definitions of a God are mutually incompatible. And it's like God is defined as a married bachelor. So why debate whether such a thing exists? Such a thing cannot exist, right? And I've done a lot of debates on exactly that, the mutually incompatible properties of the Christian God, for example. Of course, you can redefine God, and a lot of theologians have tried to do that, try to redefine God in such a way. This openness theology is one attempt that some people are using to try to limit the omniscience of God. But in any event, there's no really